I have the pleasure today, November 24th, 2019, of interviewing Avery Robinson for the Jewish Historical Society of Western Massachusetts. Welcome, Avery. Why don't you tell me something about yourself? Let's start out like that.
Thanks, Ken. It's great to be here. I do not live in Western Massachusetts formally, so I find it really exciting, interesting, novel to be interviewed in the Western Massachusetts Historical Society, as the only 2 days that I've spent in town here have been actually with you. And so not knowing as much about Western Mass, but I come from a couple different places, and maybe we can shed some light on those and work through that journey. So I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan, and my family has been there for over 100 years. I believe my great-grandfather's family, great-great-great-grandfather, we'll go back another generation on that, arrived in Detroit before World War I, and Delta Zeti, as we call them, looked just like Rasputin, a beard as thick and long and slightly sloping out, arrived in Detroit from Lechovich, which is a small town in between Minsk and Pinsk, as they used to say. Really, it's between Minsk and Brisk, but it just doesn't rhyme as well. But we know it was 4 hours by horse from Minsk. Okay. He came to Detroit and got a job as a chicken plucker. So apparently this was the only Shomer Shabbos job he could find. And at that point, seemingly, the family legend goes that we were still Shomer Shabbos. I don't know how long this lasted, but it couldn't have been too long, because as far as I know, from Delta Zeti until my family, we had a big break with Shabbos, as far as things formally went. He had 5 kids, 3 daughters, Minnie, Annie, and Fanny, and then 2 sons, Lou and Sam. And they all grew up in Detroit. At some point, they got into the peddling business. And as Detroit was becoming this industrial capital, they started peddling scrap metal, to the point where my grandfather, the son of Julius Robinson, who married Fanny Isaacovich, because Delta Zeti's last name was Isaacovich, where my grandfather eventually got into the scrap and metal business, as was very common with Jews in the Midwest in that period. My father continued in that business, and up until the year 2000, that was what my father did. He was in junkman. And whenever we drove around Detroit, whenever we talk about Detroit, it's always based on different people in the scrap and iron business, and different junkmen themselves, people who used to haul scrap for them, people who used to sell scrap to different folks, going carp dipping with Joe Zazula in Lake Erie, which was always a great story of how they used to just dip for carp, essentially with dynamite, and that's what they would bring back for Passover. Joe Zazula is not Jewish, but there would be around Easter as well, and so Joe Zazula's family and my grandfather, they used to go carp dipping together. A lot of other great stories like that my father has a repository of. Unfortunately, they are not my stories, and so I can't wax as eloquent with them. But right, so my father grew up in Detroit, as did my mother. My mother's family immigrated. My mother's family immigrated from Suwałki, Poland, to St. Ignace, which is in the Upper Peninsula. And if you've ever been to St. Ignace or to Suwałki or to the Finger Lakes, you'll notice that they look very similar. The Finger Lakes region in northern Poland, southern Lithuania, as well as the Upper Peninsula. I'm not entirely sure what brought this community from Suwałki. There was a group of them that went. I'm not entirely sure what brought them to St. Ignace, but it looks incredibly similar. From the little time that I've spent in both of those locations. And so my thought was that maybe this is a world they were familiar with. There weren't many Jews. The town, the small village in Suwałki that my family traces itself back to is called Tartak, which was known for its woodcutter for a lumber mill. And the family went from there. They found themselves in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan as they're building a lot of mining camps. A lot of Scandinavians and Northern Europeans are finding themselves over there. And somehow my family also found themselves there. And a branch of that family started the chain of department stores, Winkleman department stores. And my grandmother's family eventually moved to Detroit. I think there was just a lot more business opportunity, also a lot more social and Jewish opportunity down there. And I'm not entirely sure what year they moved down to Detroit from the Upper Peninsula, but I know they did. A really successful member of that extended clan that made it down to Detroit is William Davidson, who has a number of institutions named after him, largely through his philanthropic giving, the Davidson Foundation. But he owned Guardian Glass, and so did incredibly well for himself from a family that came from Suwałki to Segnagness
It's Mishpacha.
and to Detroit. Yeah, my grandma's first cousin, if I'm not mistaken. I don't really know him that well. Never actually met him. Never met any of those cousins.
But you got Yeches.
But I know that they're there. Well, they say that my grandma's family, we can trace our heritage back to Yechiel Halpern, who wrote a book in the early 18th century called Seder HaDorot, or Seder HaDairis, which traces a lot of rabbinical books, so books by different rabbis in Eastern and Central Europe. And in this book, he traces himself back to Rashi. So uncertain how genuine that is, but Seder HaDorot is a not insignificant book in the history of Jewish rabbinic literature. And so another Yeches side of that family is Yechiel Halpern. Yes. So that was most of my grandparents. My grandmother's last name was Scharfman. I don't know exactly where they came from before they were in Detroit, but I know they've also been in Detroit for a while, and they came from Belarus. So the Scharfman, Mildred Scharfman, married Erwin Robinson. That brought my father into this world with another 3 siblings. My mother, Anjanette Salson, A.J. Salson, married Jules Donison. Jules Donison was born in Philadelphia, grew up in an orphanage. He wrote a book about his time there and became quite good, lifelong friends with a number of the folks in this orphanage. And after World War II, moved to Detroit, opened up a travel agency shop, Donison Travel, which was one of the premier travel agencies in the Detroit Jewish community. And if you went to Israel, odds were in the 1960s and 70s that you flew with Donison, or you flew through Donison Travel Agency. After World War II, after World War II, Jules also went to fight in the Haganah and helped rescue Jewish children from orphanages throughout Europe and help bring them to Israel. So he has some interesting stories. My aunt, thank God, took down a lot of that oral history, and he wrote some of it in a book, mostly about his earlier years, which is called Deeds of Love, and that's about his the orphanage and the great work that they did over there. So he moved to Detroit. Jules Donison married A.J. Salson. They had 2 children, my mother Davida, and then also my aunt Shira. And eventually they moved to Farmington Hills, which is part of the suburbs. My father's family moved from Detroit, from Dexter Davidson area, which was also where my grandfather's travel agency was. And they moved to Huntington Woods, which is just on the north side of one of the highways that intersects and cuts across a lot of the suburbs in Detroit and sort of delineates inner ring versus slightly further suburbs. My dad's family lived there until the late 90s. And at that point, after my grandmother had passed away, my grandfather moved out to assisted living facilities, and but my dad's siblings were no longer in that neighborhood. One was in Madison, Wisconsin. Another one was further out into the suburbs. Actually, his one brother and his sister further into the suburbs, and his other sister in Madison, Wisconsin, with a fella who grew up in Iron Mountain, Michigan, which is also in the Upper Peninsula. Somehow, there are not many Jews in the Upper Peninsula, but my family managed to find a good amount of them. Yeah. My dad and my mom met when they were kids, but didn't actually start dating until I believe it was the early 1970s. My dad was working in the scrapyard. My mom was working as an occupational therapist in the Metro Detroit area, and they went to see the movie Silver Streak. My dad still shoops it up every time he talks about it, yeah, that was the big date story. Yeah, they got married in 1980. Then I have two older brothers. One was born in 1983, Ruby. Another one, Ian, 1986. And I came down in 1989. And when I was born, they moved to the village of Franklin, which is known as the town that time forgot. It's about 1,000 families, about 2 square miles, and we have a cider mill that's been an active mill since 1832. We have what used to be Franklin Public School, and it's now a Montessori school, an Islamic Montessori school, and a village green. It's really quaint and cute. My father has been running the Labor Day parade there ever since I've been conscious to it. And yeah, so growing up in Metro Detroit, in this village of Franklin, which is surprisingly one of the most Jewish towns in Michigan. It's like 65-70% Jewish. Not sure how that happened. Huntington Woods, by the way, still at like 85-90% Jewish, if not more. But Franklin is holding pretty strong at like 60-65%. We're not quite sure how that ended up. There's also a great golf course, a private country club right next door that didn't used to allow Jews to be members. So interesting how these communities sit side by side. But maybe if you were a resident of the town, the village, you had special permission because you were the right type of Jew. I have no idea how this works out. All I know is we were there. It was a great place to grow up.
What kind of Jewish consciousness did you have growing up? Where did your folks daven? And what did it mean to be Jewish for you growing up?
The other day, I was asked in a group to write out draw out 3 significant moments in my life. So the first thing I did was I made a little calendar, September 1989, and I circled September 11th, because that was the day I had my bris. So growing up, it was traditional in an extent that we did a lot of things that were Jewish, that held by tradition, but it wasn't something necessarily that my family necessarily knew why we were doing it or what it meant. We had a kosher home, but if you ask them what we were doing that was kosher, why it was kosher, what separated this or that, or why we had 2, 4, 5, 6 sets of dishes, why we had multiple sets of silverware, not just the nice china, they wouldn't necessarily be able to tell you, but that's what we did. My father likes to joke that growing up they would do Seder down at Pepe's at the corner, which was the pizza shop. And my mother grew up in a much more conservative, traditional home where keeping kosher and going to Sunday school, Hebrew school, but also Yiddish school was something that they did.
You went to a conservative shul? What was the name of it?
Growing up, we went to Sherisetic Southfield, which this was their 3rd or 4th building in the Detroit community. And then after my bar mitzvah, we started going to their satellite campus, which was further out into the suburbs, where more Jews had moved to. More recently, it was a slightly younger community, and also not as much of they didn't have as much of an edifice complex as the folks who stayed at the large Southfield synagogue.
There were 3 events you wrote down. One was the bris. What were the other 2?
All right. The second event was, now we're going to fast forward a bit, but I'll get there in 1 second. So growing up, conservative, we went to Hebrew school twice a week. I had a bar mitzvah, Parshat Lech Lecha. It's very nice. I went to public school, as did both my brothers. And growing up, we were very culturally or traditionally Jewish, but not necessarily literate in Judaism. And so I always knew like there's something slightly different. Like I didn't go out on Friday night. I kept kosher, which meant that I ate cheese pizza at friends' birthday parties. And if I had to, I would eat pepperoni pizza with the pepperonis taken off of it and maybe blotted out. But growing up, it was a traditional Jewish life without the literacy behind it or the textual knowledge. And that was totally fine and great in my family. The second item that I drew out the other day was of a Ashkenazi food symposium that I was hosting at the University of Michigan, where I did my undergraduate studies. And in my second year there, I was co-hosting this event with my friend Daniel Newman, and we decided we would invite a fellow from Zingerman's Deli, which is in Ann Arbor and a very famous deli in the United States for their bread and also for their bacon camp and their corned beef and pastrami. And so we invited the fellow from this haven of seemingly Ashkenazi history and culinary identity to come and give a talk. We brought in kosher tongue from the Romanian kosher butchers in Chicago. We made kasha varnishkas with schmaltz. I made my mother's challah. There was honey. We brought in 7-layer cake, which is in Detroit the pastry that is most common at synagogues, or at least most ubiquitously Jewish, as opposed to like a black and white cookie or the bow ties or other things that happen elsewhere. We're not a huge babka town, although the best babka in my regard is in Detroit, but I digress. So we had this wonderful event, probably 120, 130 people in a room that normally would fit 30 comfortably. And at the end of this event, there was a lady who was sitting in the front row, whose name was Jan Bluestein-Longoni, and she was sitting there with her husband, Dan Longoni. And she asked me if I would be interested in coming to check out her archive. For the past many years, Jan Longoni had been donating a number of her antiquarian cookbooks and culinary ephemera to the University of Michigan and creating what was then the Jan Bluestein-Longoni Culinary Archive, then housed at the Clements Library, now housed in special collections. And I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about, but this sounds amazing because I loved Jewish food. I loved food culture. I believe I got a lot of this from my mother, who was an amazing cook, and instilled in me a love of food. And also not having many friends in middle school and high school, I loved the Food Network. And so I came to understand a lot more about food, and then came to find meaning through food. And so hosting this event, where Zach Berg from Zingerman's came and spoke, really opened up the door to something much more. And for the next 2 years at the University of Michigan, I was a volunteer researcher in Jan's archive at the university, and that then led me to about 3 weeks before commencement my senior year, realizing that I actually wanted to do something much more with that research. And so from poring over 19th and early 20th century cookbooks, charity cookbooks, professional cookbooks, as well as cookbooks produced by like food retailers like Planters Peanuts or Wolf's Kasha and the Manischewitz Company, poring over those cookbooks and trying to understand what was happening in them, what was distinctly Jewish, American, what was unique to that decade or moment or advertiser or Jewish community, whether they were in San Francisco in 1908 or they were in in New York City in 1899, just trying to understand what's happening at these different communities, different cookbooks, and how that's different from what's happening in 1950 or 1955 when you have the Molly Goldberg cookbook, and trying to think about the evolution of Jewish food. So I had this amazing day of research, looking at one item on a microfilm, comparing that with an 1880s cookbook on microfilm with an 1880s Yiddish cookbook in its original print. And I had never read Gothic German before. I cannot read German. I don't know German. But yet here I am trying to compare this book against a Yiddish book written in Hebrew characters. Now, mind you, despite growing up in a Jewish space, I had no idea that Yiddish was written in Hebrew characters. Thought it was just written in whatever you had around, and I knew of it from Seinfeld-esque American traditions, where it's written in English, and it's just another part of our cultural. But then I realized that it's not, that it is its own wonderful language and wonderful culture, and here I am trying to compare these two pieces to see if one is translated verbatim from the other. Now, we didn't get very far with that because neither of us could read the Gothic German, and while I could phonetically spell out or read out the Yiddish, there was no way that we could actually compare. But it was an incredible day. And so the next day I went to the director of Judaic Studies at the Frankel Center at the University of Michigan. Her name is Deborah Dashmore, and I asked her if she would be okay with me getting a PhD in kugel. Because what I had noticed was that a lot of the kugel recipes in these early books were called pudding or something else. There was just kugel was missing in a way that I didn't think that it should be missing in history, especially given the way that I understood kugel at that time. Incidentally, I was also hosting the annual Malka and Elimelech Kugel Off at the University of Michigan through the Jewish Culture Club that I ran, which called Shmooze, which was started by my brother, who founded the title of Schmoozolophagus. And so we had all these different cookbooks with different names and manifestations of what kugel could have been. But a lot of them were not labeled as kugel, so I was wondering, where is the kugel? I thought that seemed like an interesting research question. That's a PhD-worthy material. So I asked Professor Dashmore if I could get a PhD in kugel. And the long and the short of it, she said, well, why don't we start you off with a master's? So I said, this is amazing. By the way, this is not a professional degree, and I don't think I can really pay for this. So if there's any way that the university can help support me and that the Frankel Center could have any funds, that'd be wonderful. Also, I'm leaving in 3 weeks to go to South America for the entire summer to go travel with my brother, who's finishing the Peace Corps. So I don't know what's needed to apply to the University of Michigan's graduate school programs, but I don't know what I will be able to do in that interim time. Fast forward a couple months, I'm in Peru on the Amazon River with my brother, get an email, congratulations, welcome to the University of Michigan Graduate School. And welcome to the University of Michigan, and here's a couple $1,000s for your first semester. So, spent some time with my brother, took one more course in Wyoming. I had to do a geology field course, which was a great way to wrap up my undergrad. And then I went back to Ann Arbor, and I was starting a master's in Jewish studies, where I was focusing on kugel. So I was actually continuing my research with Jan, and also learning a lot about Jewish text, Jewish history, Yiddish. I was taking Yiddish language courses, and actually getting deeper into Jewish content, because despite the fact that I had grown up in Hebrew school, despite the fact that my family kept kosher, that I spent a year in Israel after high school on a gap year program and learned a little bit of Hebrew, but not a whole lot. And the fact that I was then at the University of Michigan for 4 years running Jewish cultural classes, I never learned Yiddish, didn't know much about it, nor actually taken classes in the Department of Judaic Studies. But here I was. And so took a number of courses, mostly in Eastern European Jewish history. So I figured if I'm going to do this thing about Kugel, I ought to know Yiddish, I ought to know the culture, I ought to know the background. I had done some anthropology in undergrad, and so I figured that that was also a good angle into understanding people and peoplehood and the who and the why of eating kugel. So spent 2 years in Ann Arbor in grad school, working on this thesis, spending time in the summers in New York City at the Saltzman Archive at the New York Public Library, as well as at YIVO's at the Center for Jewish History, looking in their cookbook collection.
What's the Saltzman collection?
The Saltzman collection is it's part of the Derot division at the New York Public Library, and it's a collection of Jewish cookbooks, mostly charity cookbooks, but a lot of other cookbooks from around the world. I believe they're mostly charity cookbooks.
What kind?
Charity.
Charity, okay.
Yeah. Books that were produced by different communities to raise money, sometimes for a new building fund, sometimes for sisterhood events, different charities. So I spent a summer in those spaces. Also at the Yiddish farm, which at that time was the second year of its existence. It was an organic, now certified organic farm in Orange County, New York, in Goshen, New York, the prime of Jewish exile, or exiledom, diaspora, galut, where they only speak Yiddish and also farm. At that point, they were growing about 10,000 heads of hardneck garlic and working their way to grow a lot of wheat for matzah, which is now their big seller. And they had Yiddish classes every day for many hours in the morning. And then also late in the evening, we would come back and we would learn Yiddish. We would sing Yiddish in the same way that I was doing this at university, except it was an immersive space. We were only speaking in Yiddish.
So you're farming during the day?
Farming during the day. And then Yiddish surrounding that. And Heshi Black, this 15-year-old Satmar kid, is our chef. I have no idea how they found Heshi. And I have no idea what qualified him to be their chef. His repertoire included mayonnaise, kasha, and ground meat. His specialty was when he put all three of them in the same dish. And I'm a vegetarian. I was like, I'm going to farm. This will be perfect. Didn't eat so well those few weeks, but had a great time. Yiddish farm, a couple of archives in New York City, living in Brooklyn. And then I went back to Ann Arbor. Went back to Ann Arbor, and Jan and I put together an exhibit. It was called American Foodways, the Jewish Contribution. For like 4 or 5 months, we took over the lower exhibit spaces in Hatcher's graduate library and hosted a couple of folks to come and speak. And I put everything online because I was like, if I'm going to do this piece, I don't know if I'm going to get a PhD or not, or whatever I'm doing, but in general, this exhibit should be digitized. We should not lose this work just because this exhibit cannot be permanent. So there's a digital reflection or a digital copy of this exhibit.
What's it called? Where can you find it?
It's available in the University of Michigan Library System, American Foodways, the Jewish Contribution, co-curated by Jan Langone and myself. And there was a great team that was also there helping us. The plan was to do a whole series of American foodways. So an Irish contribution, the Scottish contribution, the Chinese American contribution, the Mexican contributions, all these different ethnic, culinary, and cultural communities who would be contributing to what became American foodways. And so we started with the Jewish one because that was the work that we were doing. And I had a lot of energy for that, which was great. So put together that exhibit, which is amazing. And then in my 4th semester at the university, I realized I should probably start writing my thesis because I was working on this exhibit for a while. Also, I started to become a GSI or a teacher, graduate student instructor. and started to write this thesis. It was amazing. Wrote about 100 pages on Jewish American culinary identity and cultural practice through the lens of kugel. It's available online. It's on academia.edu. If you search Avery Robinson kugel, there may be many things that pop up, but the thing on academia.edu, that will be the thesis. And I hope you enjoyed reading it.
So you finished at Michigan, and now what are you going to do? You've got all this background in food. What's the next in your adventure?
Right. So I finished in Michigan. This was spring 2014. I sent out a couple failed applications to different PhD programs.
In Kugel?
Yeah. So I actually applied asking to do my master's thesis as a PhD program because that was the work that I wanted to do, and I had not done it yet. So I was like, this is great. This is what I want. Hey, Berkeley. Hey, Michigan. Hey, UNC. Other good public schools with history programs. Let's do it. Didn't work out. So I spent a year taking another personal Shemitah year. 7 years ago, I had taken a gap year, lived in Israel. So now, after some Yiddish and some Hebrew and some Jewish food, I figured I'd live in Brooklyn. I'd write some public history, maybe work at a bougie bagel shop, teach Hebrew, or teach at a Hebrew school because there's great money in that for those who have the time for it. Petal beard balm. This is this like beard product that a buddy of mine in Detroit was making. It was a conditioner and moisturizer for beards and faces, or for hair and faces. And so I started peddling that in Brooklyn at fancy barbershops and amongst the Chabad world. It was as ridiculous as it sounds. I ended up working in New York's bougiest bagel shop, which was called Black Seed Bagel. It's a Montreal-style bagel place that opened up a couple months before.
What were you doing in the bagel shop?
Mostly I was a civil sandwich engineer. I was making sandwiches. But I was a utility player, and I really like schmoozing with customers. So if we were having a slow day, depending on what was happening, I would also take over the point of sale, or I would help out rolling and making bagels.
Where in Brooklyn was this?
This was actually in Soho. It was in Manhattan.
What street?
This was at 170 Elizabeth Street. Still there today. And they also have a spot now on 1st Avenue and 11th Street.
So you spent a year in Brooklyn doing this and other things?
Yes.
This was
and
your Shemitah year.
My Shemitah year. I tried to write a chapter for a history book that was being put forward. I believe it was through the CAJM, the Council for American Jewish Museums, and I was writing a chapter on the Jewish home. I tried to write this chapter 3 times, but each time the editor, who's a really great guy and incredibly accomplished individual, didn't quite like what I was putting forward, didn't give me the best guidance for what he did want, so I ended up writing 15,000 words, revising it to write another 15,000 words, and then round 3, another 10,000 words or so, each time neglected, denied, and I feel that at that point I hit a large writer's block. I also may have just been exhausted from writing and from talking about kugel. So at that point I went to Hadar, which is an egalitarian yeshiva in the Upper West Side. And I studied Torah for the first time because I realized that maybe what I actually need to do is understand where Jewish food is coming from. What is the source of all this? And I have a master's in Jewish studies, but really, I don't know anything about Jewish texts unless they're edible. And I'm pretty sure people don't want to be eating the Talmud or the Torah. So I figured I should learn something else to augment the edible, the palatable history that I had. And so I spent a year at yeshiva. It was a great year. Really wonderful people in my cohort. Not the best learning space for me, but I totally would recommend it for people who are interested in it and with some caveats. Spent a year there, and then I realized, okay, the only Torah that I actually understood was about food. If we're talking about a lentil's worth of lizard, and is that permissible or not on Yom Kippur while you're fasting, I can understand that. And if we're talking about a tree that has a flavor and a scent, and it's about Sukkot, and it's about what actually is the pre-Eitz Hadar, what is the tree of the Hadar fruit, then I can understand that. Apparently they said it's an etrog or a citron. Okay, who am I to argue with the rabbis? But these were the things that I could understand in Torah. When it was about food, when it used food as a metaphor, when it used food to, when it was talking about food very literally and very clearly, that was the Torah that I got. So I realized that maybe there's more to this Jewish food thing than I thought about. So I should go to Israel, where they have more diaspora Jewish foods accessible to people than any other singular place that I'm aware of. And it happens to be in a place where I had spent a little bit of time, where I did feel comfortable traveling on my own, and where I knew that there were a lot of other social things happening that would make that trip, that time spent there, very worthwhile. So I applied for and was accepted to a Derot Fellowship, which is, year that I was there, 12 North American Jews, age 21 to 30, who spend a year together, once a week, coming together for a leadership development through emotional intelligence programming that we would organize for ourselves, and then spending the rest of the week to do whatever we want. For me, that was Jewish food. That was understanding Jewish foodways, culinary history, learning about coffee and cafes and coffee houses, and what's happening in Palestinian coffee houses, in Druze and Bedouin traditions, in Ethiopian, Eritrean coffee traditions, what happened with all the Viennese cafes and the Berlin coffee drinkers, and the Odessans when they came to Israel. What about the Italians and the French and the British and the Russians and all these different coffee traditions? How did these manifest in Israel or in Israel-Palestine to create the coffee traditions that we have today? Similarly, what about the coffee that they've been drinking there since at least 1580, because we know there was a coffee house in Tzfat in 1580. So how have these coffee traditions changed? What does that mean when people are serving coffee? What are people eating with coffee? What does that share for social identity, for political identity, for cultural practice? So I was interested in all these things, and I decided I would look at it through the cafe, through the bakery, and also at a soup kitchen, where I spent about 20 hours a week volunteering there. And this was all in Tel Aviv. And then, incidentally, one time a week I had this Derot programming, which was a very challenging space. It happened to be 2016, 2017 that I was in Israel. So there was a landmark election in the United States that really changed the way in which people communicated on social media, changed the way in which people communicated in general. And I was very far away from family and friends. And I was feeling like a shell of myself in Israel as I'm trying to learn Hebrew. And I'm connecting with people over food, but also connecting with people in a soup kitchen. And so being in a very different space from a lot of the intellectual headspace that is happening elsewhere, and a lot of the trauma and sense of trauma that people are feeling, talking about in Anglo spaces. And so I felt very removed and isolated from those things, but also very much invested in the food work that I was doing there and trying to understand people through food.
In the soup kitchen, what did you do exactly? Did you prepare the food? Did you serve the food? And this give you an opportunity to schmooze with the people and talk about what they enjoyed eating? What exactly did you do there?
Absolutely. Yeah, so soup kitchen, I was mostly serving food, but not serving food on a line and scooping out and putting it on someone's plate, actually working as like a waiter to some extent and bringing people food on a tray, setting it down before them, and to the extent that I was able to, also sitting with them and schmoozing with a lot of these folks. I also did prepare food and was a person who physically served food onto trays, but the bulk of the work that I was doing there was the soft skills, schmoozing, and being present with the patrons of the soup kitchen.
Were these people from a certain economic background?
So people at this soup kitchen, which was called Lasova, and it's in South Tel Aviv, came from all over. Some of these people had homes. Some of these people were pensioners. They may have been native-born Israelis or immigrants from Russia in the 1990s, but also immigrants from Russia maybe from the 1960s, who came over before there were even more serious restrictions on them. There were Eritrean refugees and asylum seekers. There were also a number of Filipino home care workers who were there, who were not presently working or who came with someone. There were Israelis of all different ages, as well as immigrants, Jewish immigrants. Maybe they were from Argentina or the United States even, London, Paris, who came and were eating there. There were also a number of Ethiopian Israelis who were eating there. And occasionally some Palestinian workers. There was a construction site next door. And so some Palestinian workers, people who lived in the West Bank, who were working on this construction site, or Palestinian Israelis, they would be eating there.
And they all ate together.
And they all ate together.
How many people would be served at a sitting? And how many sittings were there?
So one sitting a day, Sunday through Thursday, and then Friday night there would be a sitting during the day, and then also a Friday night dinner. The daytime sitting would be generally from 10 a.m. until 2 p.m., and then the dinner would be much later. And also the dinner was generally marketed towards the Jewish clientele, and they put forward some very funny signage that I don't want to misquote right now, but I have images of this to try and deter non-Jewish patrons from coming on Friday night, because they wanted to create a holy Shabbos space, and because it was a kosher soup kitchen supported by the Tel Aviv municipality and other institutions, they felt obliged to do this and to some extent deter non-Jewish consumers at that hour. The soup kitchen also hosted a number of Ovdei Sherut, forced volunteers. So in lieu of a prison service, they were doing their volunteer hours. So there were a number of people who were working with me.
This is a big soup kitchen.
Yeah, about 400 meals a day in those 4 hours.
What kind of foods were served?
So if you happen to have a favorite hotel buffet in Tel Aviv, odds are we were getting their leftovers. So we got material from a number of the hotels in Tel Aviv, a number of municipal buildings that have kitchens, as well as restaurants. We had bread from Lechamim, which is Bread's Bakery in New York City, and it's probably Tel Aviv's premier, most popular bakery, and one of the leaders of what is new and fancy and better bread in Israel. And bread from a couple of other locations as well. Like, this is not drach and like filth that people are eating. And then sometimes when they didn't have as much food from some of these places, they're making lots of rice or petitim, which are Israeli couscous, which is made of pasta grains, in fact, or other pasta noodles and orzo pilaf that they are getting donated to them dry from grocery stores or through Leket, which is a gleaning organization in Israel. Also a lot of produce.
So did they cook on site, or all
Yeah.
the food was? They did also cooked on site.
We cooked on site, made a lot of food on site, especially salads, because we would get a lot of raw vegetables. So every meal there would be different cups of salad that people would be getting. Made it all on site. It was a fleishig restaurant, kosher fleishig meat, and when they were given dairy donations, they would then give those to the different programs that soup kitchen then provided food for. So there was a women's shelter upstairs. They provided food to a drug rehab community space a couple blocks away. They also provided food to a couple senior residence facilities, as well as to school programs nearby. So this was a sort of a clearance house for food donations to different communities in Tel Aviv, as much as it was a soup kitchen in and of itself.
And you said it was kosher. Did they have mashgiach so the Orthodox could come to it? How did they deal with that?
There was a mashgiach who would come in and check, and mostly they knew that they were only receiving food from certified kosher places, which came with its label on. And then there was a mashgiach who would come and check. I don't know the frequency because I wasn't in the kitchen the entire time.
So you'd have Orthodox people coming to eat there also.
Absolutely.
No problem.
Yeah, people who would be like visibly Orthodox with a kippah and tzitzis,
Uh-huh.
and people who would be saying the blessings before and after the food, and also people who were not as visibly Orthodox, but for whom it was very important for them that they were getting kosher food.
How many soup kitchens are there in Tel Aviv besides this one?
There's one in the north of Tel Aviv, along the Hayarkon River, and there may be one other one, but I'm not positive.
When you had conversations with the people coming for the meals,
Mhm.
what would you talk about?
We spoke about a lot of different things. Sometimes it would be, what's your favorite bathroom in Tel Aviv? Because these are people, some of them who are homeless, some of them who are not, but for whom finding a clean, comfortable bathroom facility is really important. I would say more often than not, we would speak about the food, because that's the vocabulary that I actually had, especially at the beginning, but also that it was a safe topic. Some of these folks were drug addicts, some of these folks were prostitutes, former drug addicts, people who've gone through incredible trauma, whether it's because they were a soldier, whether it's because they were a refugee or an asylum seeker, or they were in abusive relationships, or they are in an abusive relationship at that moment, or whatever other health issues they have. And so we started off with something nice and easy and simple, and sometimes that would be an incredibly profound conversation. Like with there is a group of Eritrean fellows that I would talk to frequently, and they asked me, what's the deal with this petit team stuff? What's happening with Israeli couscous? And so then I was like, oh, this makes a lot of sense. You have no idea what this food is, and you also did not grow up learning about Israel's history and the 1950s austerity and why we call it Ben Gurion's rice. And there's so many different pieces of this, of like, this is not couscous, and it's not rice, and it's not a pasta that they know, and they don't like eating it. And not just because they were forced to eat it in austerity like many Israelis were. And so that was like a really eye-opening conversation that I get to have with people and understand where they're coming from with food, how the food that they are eating does or does not jive with their food preferences, and why sometimes when they get served what they would affectionately be called turkey butts, people would not want to eat them. There was a certain cut of the turkey that was known in the soup kitchen community as the turkey butt. I don't know what exactly this is. It sounds rather straightforward, but I've never heard of that as like a cut of meat. But it was something that was rather universally disliked. But there were other foods that were beloved by all.
What was popular?
Schnitzel. Schnitzel was very popular. Kebab, meat skewers, not skewered, but like the meatballs. Those were very popular. Also just like roasted chicken, grilled chicken, that was very popular. But turkey butt, not so popular. Kube, so beef-filled semolina rice or bulgur balls, which are traditionally Iraqi and often eaten in a soup form, are eaten as a dumpling in a soup. They were generally not liked, even by the 95-year-old Iraqi woman Farha, who couldn't see and was a cranky, lovely woman, and had an incredible relationship with this fellow Yosef, who was a Eritrean refugee who knew English very well, and who somehow took her under his wing as the two of them are in the soup kitchen together, and he was like her advocate. But she, as someone who grew up in Iraq, did not like the kube. I don't know why. I didn't have the kube because I don't eat meat, but most of the vegetarian things I would eat because I want to understand what is it that we are serving, and is it they don't like petitim because they taste bad? Is it that people don't like petitim because they are this weird rice thing that's not rice, that's gummy, that there's no sauce? What exactly? I don't know. But yeah, I would say meat and also roasted potatoes and fried potatoes, those were beloved. They didn't fry potatoes there, but that was a...
So you did a year in the soup kitchen as part of the Dorot Fellowship.
Correct.
And the year came to an end. So what's going to happen?
So...
It was a remarkable experience, it sounds like.
It was incredible. That soup kitchen was a really transformative, magical space. The people there, yeah, there's a lot there.
The Shabbat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even like the Ovdei Sharut, I'm friends with a number of them. I have no idea what brought them there. That was not a question that I ever wanted to know. But they seem to have been, we'll call it rehabilitated. If they ever needed that beforehand, that for some reason that they came there. But really great people, and whenever I see some of those folks on the street in the ensuing year, I ended up staying in Israel. Surprise, but we'll continue there in a moment. I would actually talk to these folks instead of avoiding them on the street in the way that most people avoid beggars, homeless, or people with nasty looking legs and nails that just are lying on a sidewalk. I actually had something to go back to these folks with. And assuming they remembered me, which depending on our interactions, maybe they very much did, that felt really special and really real to be able to see folks in a city and not just walk by them in the way that I do very much to this day in most cities that I travel in, because I only have so much time and I'm going from A to B. And that is just an unfortunate reality that I live with and a choice that I make. So the Derot year ended, and I was volunteering in a Yiddish archive not too far away from the soup kitchen for a couple hours a week, and it was called Jung Yiddish, and this is in the central bus station in Tel Aviv. And at that point in time, it's probably the fifth or sixth largest archive of Yiddish books in the world. They have zero catalog that I'm aware of, and they have tens of thousands of books lying in storage, meaning in boxes, covered in inches of dust, neglected in a corner of the central bus station, hidden behind a wall of books.
Tell me how the central bus station was selected. What's the history of that bus station? And how did this whole enormous Yiddish archive get started? And how did you find yourself there?
In the 1980s, Mendy Kahana, who was born in Romania, grew up in Belgium, or his family was born in Romania, but he grew up in Belgium, lived in it, moved to Israel, and is an actor, but had a radio show in Jerusalem. Was realizing that a lot of people were throwing out their books in a very similar way to how the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Hampshire College, founded itself. And I believe he actually may have done some work with Lansky in the early years. He had this radio show and would just call out and say, hey, don't throw your books out when your grandparents are dying. Send them to me. So he filled up his apartment in Jerusalem. And then, once his apartment was full, he then rented another space and started to fill that space up and had 5,000 plus books. Realized he had more books coming than he had space for. And he didn't know what to do with just having books. So he partnered with an institution in Tel Aviv. I believe it was Beit Leivik, but I'm not positive. And was given space in their basement to store a lot of his books. In 2006, he was no longer allowed to stay at Beit Leivik. The exact reasons are not as clear to me, and I'm not sure who pushed who or who went where. But pretty much in the middle of the night, he moved his stuff into the central bus station. This is in 2006, when the central bus station in Tel Aviv, which was originally started to be constructed in 1969, was not finished until 1994, and destroyed the community that was around it because it took so long for this white elephant to actually come up.
2004 it was completed?
1994. Took 25 years to build. 1969 to 1994. And it took...
Destroyed the whole community.
Yeah. So one, it was a community of mostly Mizrahi immigrants, and then it was a community of Ethiopian Israeli refugees, and then it was a community of Russian immigrants. And then, once in the 1994, once the station is now open, no one wants to be there. took 25 years to build this building that they thought was going to have 1 million people passing through it every day in a country that in 1969 had 3.5 million people, and they thought buses were the future of transportation in Israel. So they built this massive complex, a Soviet brutalist building that was intended for people to get lost in it. And in this building, the city of Tel Aviv realized that they needed to do something about it to give it a little bit of vigor and inspiration and love, because no one wanted to be there. So they offered up cheap units to artists to have their studios there. Now at this point, there were people living in the central bus station. There was a lot of drug problems there. There was some prostitution and a number of other illicit activities that were happening in the building and nearby, mostly because it was so neglected. And it became just an absolute eyesore, socially and physically. And in 2006, Mendy Kahane moved his Yiddish books into a corner in this building, into a space that, as I describe people when they enter the building, walk down the large hallway, walk as far away as you can from the McDonald's. When you get to the end of the hallway, past the Filipino Shuk, past the bootleg video games and DVDs and porn DVDs, past the instrument salespeople, past the Druze ladies who are making pita a couple days a week, there is a stairway recessed into the wall. Walk up that stairwell to the 5th floor. Now mind you, you walked into the building on the 4th floor. Walk up that stairway to the 5th floor. You're going to find yourself in a corridor that is dark and rather abandoned. Walk further down that corridor, as if you were going to a place where you're like, if I scream, is anyone going to hear me? And then you know in your head that the answer is no, and you're feeling no, but Avery said to walk over there, so you're going to go. And so you get into that corner, and there's a Filipino church, there's a couple artist studios, and then there's what looks like an antiquity store, like an antique shop that came out of Central Europe in 1970 and hasn't been dusted since. And in that unit, there's a door in the far back. And if you open up that flimsy wooden panel, you'll see that there is actually a room filled with a fish tank and tens of thousands of Yiddish books and newspapers and a couple of small exhibits that are on display, a couple full editions of De Gold and a Kite to Welcome You In, which is a Yiddish journal published in Israel. And you're going to realize that this is a very different space than anything you've ever encountered. It is absolutely not climate controlled. There is no catalog to these books. There's no order to what you think you are seeing. The organization of the chairs changes every day based on the events. There's probably going to be 1 or 2 people smoking in the corner. And by the corner, I mean anywhere. And you're wondering, is it okay to smoke in this space? And they're just flicking their ash all over the place. Like, what about these books? And you realize, now we're in 2017 when I'm telling this story. Well, today is 2019. But when I'm arriving there and volunteering there, well, these books have survived long enough. They'll probably be okay. And there's a bar, and there will be evening programming all the time, whether it's klezmer music, Hebrew avant-garde, poetry readings, or theater, naked Hebrew poetry as people are rolling around on the ground in this ash and doing other peculiar activities. Trapeze artists, seer circle dancing, which is this form of dance art that is popular at circuses these days. And it's essentially someone in a big metal circle and with their legs on one side and their arms over there, and they're just spinning around and doing crazy, beautiful things with their body. There will be a one-man burlesque cabaret Purim spiel, which is the best Purim spiel I've ever seen in my life, that Mendy Kahane does, and a number of other programs in Yiddish, in Hebrew, and in Russian that are happening not infrequently. And I learned to never be surprised by that space. They do a great Yom HaShoah, a great Holocaust Remembrance Day poetry reading in Yiddish. where they light taper candles and pretty much hang them over the books that are lining the walls. And you're like, whew, okay. So like I'm walking into a space and there are candles flickering and it's really dark and the candles are just like resting on these books. They're not quite resting on these books, but it feels that way. There's tiny little shot glasses that they're resting in on the books. No, slightly better. And Mendy is sitting there. There's candles around him of all different heights. And he's reading Yiddish poetry. And every minute or two, there's just this quaking from the buses rattling up about. Because we're on the 5th floor, and on the 6th floor is all the buses that are traveling elsewhere throughout Israel. And then on the 4th floor, the other buses that are traveling throughout Tel Aviv. And so every couple minutes, there's just this shaking and quaking. And you're looking around, and there's these candles, and they're flickering. And there's no climate control. There's a window that may be open, maybe broken, maybe has a screen, maybe not. Who knows? And you just wonder, like, what's happening in this space? Is the Yiddish going to just fall down and burn around you? Are these piles of books that have been absolutely neglected, that no one has any idea of what's inside of them or where they are, or if there's any gems or not, if there's any lost treasures of Yiddish and Jewish culture, people's stories? What's going to happen? And the buses pass. And Mendy continues reading. And you realize that even after all the destruction and after all the whispers of persecution and fear and threats to all of these books, it's still standing. We're still here. And it's just one of the most beautiful poetic scenes I can imagine. And even if you're not there when Mendy's doing a Yom HaShoah reading or any other time, you still get the buses coming in overhead, and you still get these books lying, waiting to be cataloged, to be preserved, to be archived, to be digitized, to be explored. So when I wrapped up my time with Dorot, I knew about this place. I was volunteering there and decided, great, I have time right now. I have no obligations. I have no debt, and I have a little bit of money. I am going to spend my time creating an archive of these books, creating a catalog, creating something real and genuine of this, of what they have here. Because in the moment, no one knows what they have. No one can access it. And if there's anything really important, it will be lost until some crazy Michigan Yid comes and tries to do what I'm doing. And so for the next month and a half, I put in 70-hour weeks, also still visiting the soup kitchen, working there, to try and alphabetize these books and to give them a very brief, cursory order. And I realized that doing this, we needed shelves. These books were in boxes, and I was taking them out of boxes, but I couldn't just put them back in a box. That doesn't help anyone, unless I had the time to print out what was going in each and every box. Clearly, that was not the case. Surprisingly, I didn't find any golems in the corner after unearthing a lot of this material. And looking for shelves. Reached out to a couple different foundations that I knew. Alas, no one knew what was in the collection. So what they're going to support this? Maybe every single book there is already digitized by the great work that was happening at the Yiddish Book Center and that is now being done at the National Library. Maybe all of these books are already available. Why should they help with these? What is unique to this collection? I have no idea. I can tell you what's unique to that space. I can tell you that it's one of the few vibrant, alternative, Yiddish-speaking spaces in Israel. It's also a space where Haredim are coming to visit and sing and perform and engage with people in a Yiddish atmosphere on their level, but also with secular Israelis and non-secular Israelis as well. And then it is a space where there are now Yiddish classes because Eli, who grew up in Bnei Brak and then became a volunteer at the Yiddish Archive, realized that this is something that he really wanted to do. So no formal training as an educator, but after he left the army and found this space, found himself really at home there. And now, since I've left Israel, has really come to do a lot with the programming there, with the musical acts, as well as Yiddish educational work. But I digress. So, I'm trying to raise $5,000 for shelves, because we have to put the books up. We need to create a very base order because we can't have the books sitting on the ground, not in boxes anymore. Especially with winter coming. Because with winter coming, it means that we don't know where the leaks are in the roof, but we do know that there are leaks in the roof. We do know that there are leaks in the bus ramp, and we know that water is going to come in, because it does every year. Just the question is of where. So, trying to raise some money. At present, unsuccessful. I find out from my friend that his mother is in town for a little bit of work, as she is often in the summer. She comes to Jerusalem, and she is associated with the Posen Foundation. Posen Foundation, I know of them because they provide funds for secular Jewish cultural education in Israel. Secular Jewish cultural education, Yiddish as secular Jewish culture, Yiddish as religious culture that is being engaged in by secular Jews, Yiddish as religious life that is now being explored again because Israel is not shying away from Yiddish. Yiddish because there's so much opportunity there for speaking to a world that was lost instead of just the Holocaust. Not a world that's destroyed, but the world that was destroyed. What was it? Why did we care? Why do our parents and grandparents occasionally speak in this language? And why is Jewish food in Israel Ashkenazi food? Answers exist in many of these books. Also, there's a great book on Palestinian Yiddish, which I had never seen before doing this work. And I realized that there's this whole tradition and evolution of the Yiddish language that happened in Palestine. So, I go to meet my friend's mother. Turns out she doesn't work for the Posen Foundation. She works for the Posen Library, and thus cannot give me any money for this project. But, recognizing that they need a lot of work for the Posen Library in Israel, thinks that she can offer me a job. So I'm like, whoa. I came here trying to raise money for this foundation just to get like $5,000 for some Yiddish bookshelves. And you're going to offer me a job? This is scandalous, and I'm loving it. And so the job is to help the Posen Library, which is an anthology of Jewish culture and civilization, put together its remaining 9 volumes of Jewish life in primary sources that will be translated into English, if not already in English, and prepare these books for publication, and then also to get them digitized so that everything is available online for free for anyone who's interested in Jewish cultural history in the English language using resources that have previously never really been available before, and also opening up the canon of Jewish life to include not just the dominant Ashkenazi Orthodox Zionist narratives, and also male, but also a much larger, broader view of what is Jewish culture and history, what was Jewish community life at all these times. How is Karl Marx and Emma Lazarus and Harry Houdini and Claude Cahun, a gender-bending photographer, putting all these together in the same conversation. And that's the Posen Library. And then I said, great, I would love a job. I've never had one before. So unfortunately, I had to leave the Yiddish archive. I didn't formally leave. I was still doing some work with them in the evenings. But I got this job, which was amazing. Stayed in Israel for another year, helping to find material for these books, working with a number of incredible professors at the Hebrew University, spending time at the National Archives, the National Library of Israel at Mount Scopus, or not Mount Scopus, at Hebrew University's Givat Ram campus in Jerusalem, and putting together this book. And so,
which book is this now?
This is the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. It's a 10-volume series.
So you're finding documents for different volumes as part of this series? Some of the volumes have been published already.
So when I was hired, volume 10, corresponding to the years 1973 to 2005, co-edited by Deborah Dashmore, who you may recall as my master's thesis advisor, and Nurit Wirtz-Nesher, who is a professor of Hebrew literature at Tel Aviv University. They produced this volume. Incidentally, 2012 is when I started my master's program, And so Deborah had finished with this, but was also doing projects on the side to publicize and talk about this new book of hers. But I wasn't as aware of it at that time, or at least I'm not so aware. I'm not aware that I was. Now Deborah is the editor-in-chief of this volume, and so she knew the work that I was able to do, knew my research skills, and decided that, yeah, I was a totally fine and adept candidate for this position. In fact, now that I actually knew some Hebrew, having lived in Israel for a full year at this point, in spaces where I was not speaking English, and that I had a little bit more Yiddish chops, although not as great as they used to be, that I would actually be a pretty good fit for this project. And I'm really happy that it all worked out, because now I guess now it's been 28, 30 months or so since I started this project. And this week, in fact, we are publishing Volume 6, corresponding to the years 1750 to 1880, edited by Elisheva Karobach. We're publishing her volume. And we're renovating our digital webpage so that in a month or two, everything will be fully accessible and visible and usable for these two volumes, as well as the other volumes, which are planned to come out in March and in October. And we have a schedule from there on out.
How does one find the Posen Library online? What's the site?
PosenLibrary.com. POSENLIBRARY.com.
So, have you been an itinerant scholar, wandering the planet in search of material and traveling in this country also? How do things work for you?
So, Durot year ended, started this project 2 months later for nearly a year. And then in August 2018, 2 years after I arrived in Israel, at that point I left and came back to the United States and began living a peripatetic life as I was catching up with friends and family around the country. Felt that I was missing them. You may recall my brief aside about Durot earlier and how that was a difficult time for me. So now I was able to catch up with friends and family and also take advantage of great university resources around the country. So whether that's at a library in Raleigh, North Carolina, at North Carolina State, or I'm in Palo Alto at Stanford visiting a friend and I get to use their resources, spending a lot of time in Cambridge, just outside of Boston, using a lot of the Harvard resources over there. The University of Michigan has been a second home to me again, and taking advantage of different resources. But most of the work that I'm doing now is online. So in fact, I can edit this material and do my work from most anywhere, including your living room. And I will continue to do that until it comes to a point where I no longer need to be in these libraries, or when I formally need to be in an office, which at the moment we don't have an office.
You just came from Isabella Friedman. Can you tell me about what's going on with you and your food interests and how that has evolved at this point?
Yeah, so I came to Israel with Durot to do the Jewish food stuff, and then I found myself with this job and continued to do Jewish food work. So I was leading tours of the different markets in Tel Aviv, not so much the Shuk Carmel, which is the most accessible, popular market, but a couple of the other older markets, Hatikva and Levinsky, which also are full of bakeries from non-Ashkenazi traditions and also that have been around since the 1930s or 1960s, from Iraq, from Yemen, from Salonika, from, where else do we have bakeries? Bukhara. There's a great Bukharan bakery. If you're ever looking for an oven to walk into and that you will feel as a Jew safely able to walk out, there's a great bakery in Shuk HaTikva in South Tel Aviv. And so in my time working on this project, I'm still able to spend some time in the evenings and the weekends and early in the mornings doing my Jewish food research. And actually we met, you and I, Ken, after a Hazon food conference this past August, where I was giving a talk on the Jewish history of coffee, as well as a talk on the Jewish history and identity politics of wine, and when Manischewitz is treif. And so I'm still trying to get back into this Jewish food space, into this Jewish food world as an educator about Jewish culinary history and Jewish cultural practice. but that is also taking a side role to my main work right now, which I'm really excited about, and I am excited to continue doing a good job with, of the Posen Library. So, as side hustle, Jewish food educator, main hustle, Jewish cultural editor, Jewish cultural history editor.
Could you give us an advanced sense of your Schoen talk that you're giving, I think, in a week or two?
Yes.
Could you give us a little bit of the drash so we have the pleasure of hearing your thinking about Schoen?
Great. Still very much a work in progress, but Shabbos Thanksgiving 2019 is Parshat Toldot, if I'm not mistaken, which has Jacob's lentil stew. And it also happens to be Shabbos Thanksgiving, which is tradition when my family would make a cholent tailgate for the University of Michigan Ohio State football games. I think there was a rabbinic psak saying it was okay to bring cholent to one's students living in college so that they could have that on Shabbos of the coldest football game of the year. I'm pretty sure, I don't remember which Rav poskin this, but I think I remember something happened like this. Otherwise,
the footballer Rav.
Yeah, otherwise I don't think my parents would have done this. So we have in this coming week's Torah portion, Jacob's lentil stew, the red stuff, as Asa calls it, and it seems a good opportunity to speak about Jewish Sabbath stews. So we have in the Mishnah of Shabbos 2:7 a discussion of these things that you are supposed to say to your partner before Shabbat happens. Like you say these three things. Have you done X, Y, and Z? And the last word in this Mishnah is et ha-chamin. So, it's referring to the warm thing, the warm foods. And so you have within the Mishnah the first reference to this type of food that would be considered kosher for Shabbat food to be warm, which is chamin. And it's the Hebrew word for the warm thing, cham. And from there we have the Gemara and commentators moving on, evolving into what allows for a food to stay warm on Shabbat. How can you have a hot food if you're not allowed to cook, if you're not allowed to create heat or to transfer heat or to build heat? What can you do? And so you would prepare a dish and you would essentially bury it in the ground or put it in some other insulated space so that it would stay warm over Shabbat. Thank God our technology has evolved quite a bit over the years, and our affluence as well, where we are now able to access more resources, whether they are iron pots or insulated slow cookers with our timers on them, to the point where we no longer need to bury our pots in insulated caddies and then put those in somewhere else, or put it in a baker's oven. Now most bakeries are not in the center of our towns, and so we don't need to walk over there and bring our cholent or our dafina or schina or tibit, depending on the Jewish community that one came from. So dafina is what they would call it in parts of Morocco, as well as schina. And they would also call it dafina in Tunisia, if I'm not mistaken. In Iraq, they would call it tibit, and in Yemen, they would call it chamin. There are different versions of this chamin dish throughout Middle East and North Africa, and the Jewish community started calling it cholent. The general consensus on the etymology of that word is that it comes from the French chaud, which means hot, and lent, which means slow. So the slow heat. And that is the general etymology that I subscribe to, and I think most people do, as far as where that word came from. That word then migrated from France up through Alsace-Lorraine into Ashkenazi, into Germany, and then further west. When it was in Alsace-Lorraine, it got hung up a bit, and the N sound dropped a bit, so it became shalit. And so there's still Jews who will refer to the Ashkenazi slow-cooked Shabbos stew as shalit. There are also Jews who refer to the slow-cooked Shabbos stew's dumplings, which we now know as kugel. Kugel comes from the German word for ball, and was originally a dumpling in the cholent. They will refer to those dumplings as shalit as well. So depending on the evolution of one's linguistic family traditions and how you interpret it as a dish was served over time, maybe the dish itself was the shalit, or maybe the kugel was the shalit. Either way, we do know that kugel then evolved into its own right, became multiple dumplings that then formed into one large singular dish that was then either cooked in the dish as the food on top of it, or in a dish in the cholent pot, or in a dish over time. Again, affluence, technology, a separate pot, but cooked at the same time as cholent. And then also nowadays we have kugel that you can cook in an hour and a half or less. And so,
can you tell us what cholent is composed of? What makes basic cholent?
So
Is there a
cholent,
basic cholent?
I don't know if there's a universal Hamin Jewish stew, or if there is a universal Ashkenazi Shabbat stew of cholent. But I will say that the common ingredients today, post-Columbus, involve barley, onions, garlic, and potatoes. Very often there is an inexpensive cut of meat, like a flanken, or some other sort of really tough meat that is going to like stew bones and stewing cubes that will do well with a 20 hours of braising and cooking. Sometimes people will add kishka, stuffed derma, intestines with a variety of fats, carrots, onions, maybe potato or bread stuffing, bread crumb, and they will put that in there. As far as spices go, in Eastern Europe and Northern Europe, there weren't so many to work with. So it really was going to be salt, pepper, garlic, maybe caraway, but often not so much. And then depending on your affluence, maybe you'd have something more. Depending on your connection to Hungary, maybe you would have paprika. Or similarly, turkey as well. And so there weren't as many spices available then as there are now. Maybe you would put something sweet in there. So I know that my family will add ketchup. I don't know that everyone would have a tomato preserve, or that they would have something sweet like that to add in it. But really, it's one of those stews that you make do with what you have around you. If you didn't use barley, bulgur, maybe you used barley. Maybe you used kasha, buckwheat. And so the basic ingredients were a little different. In the Sephardi world, meaning around the Mediterranean, coming from the Spanish expulsion in 1492 and the Portuguese expulsion in 1498, Jews became known for putting eggs in their cholent and calling them aminados. And those are baked eggs that are baked within the cholent pot. There's also a tradition within certain Sephardi communities of separating different ingredients of their hamin, so that while everything does cook together in the different muslin or cloth bags, maybe they would have the rice and they would have the beans and they would have different items, because when you make cholent, there are a lot of rules that you don't want to break as far as kashrut of mixing things or of selecting things out. And so you would actually cook things separately in the same container, but in separate bags, so that you would actually serve it more like a stew on a platter as opposed to in a big pot. These different traditions came up throughout time and are evolutions of the kashrut practices that we have. And at the end of the day, my family now makes a vegetarian cholent, so I don't quite know how traditional and beloved it would be in the 2,000 years or so of Chamin history, but I can say that it generally works out pretty well. We had a lot of different root vegetables in there. I forgot also another common root vegetable is carrot and parsnips, because carrot has a certain sweetness to it.
What happened to the popularity of stuffed derma and kasha vanishkas? I remember bar mitzvahs, kiddush, that they always have stuffed derma when I grew up. We're talking 60 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see them anymore, the kiddushes I go to.
Right.
What happened?
Well, I wish I could just tell you should be going to different kiddushes, but I don't think that's going to solve the problem. I think a lot of the butchers who knew how to make these foods are no longer there. I think a lot of the mothers, bubbies, great-grandmothers, the balabustas, the masters of the house, those whose domain was the kitchen and who ruled with an iron pot, bless their souls. That tradition was really not passed down so well. A lot of these dishes are not popular dishes in American Jewish cookbooks. And so particularly for our space, of the American Jewish Kiddush scene and the American Jewish kitchen, these dishes were not passed down with great authority and number and frequency in a way that other traditions and other dishes may have. So there's that component to it. There's a certain health component to it that really got stamped out in the 1970s and 80s and 90s with the LITE, light health fads, and the different diet things of the Atkins and this and that, whereby people were less excited about it. Kishka is a smelly food. People didn't love that. And the same thing with gullah or pcha, the aspic of beef bones that people would boil down. These things which, while flavor-wise, are probably amazing. And similarly with schmaltz, there is something truly, truly remarkable about what schmaltz can do to a dish that any other veggie cooking oil or even butter just doesn't quite bring it together. But how many people are getting schmaltz and frying up chicken skin and that, making gribness, in a similar way to how many folks in the American South or migrants from the American South and Southern cooking traditions are making cracklings. That is a smelly, serious adventure. And I will say that a lot more people are probably making cracklings than they are gribness, but a lot more people came from cracklings, and also as a marker of an American food that was theirs, that was a part of their cultural identity when nothing else was available. Jews found that so many other things were available. We assimilated our cuisines pretty well, to the point where in Crown Heights and Borough Park, if you go to a Jewish restaurant, they will probably have sushi and French fries. And if they're a dairy place, they'll probably have pizza. And if they're a fleishig place, then you'll probably get chicken cutlets. But still, sushi and falafel can be, and French fries are on offer.
Have you studied the Kiddush, the Kiddushim in America? After the Shabbos service, the meal. Mm-hmm. Have you done a study? Is there uniformity to them pretty much? Or how does that all get involved? Like right. An Orthodox Kiddush, a conservative one, it's just a local custom? How does that work? Yeah,
I have not done a study on this. I would say local custom, local affluence, a lot of these play a role in this, and also the liveliness of that shul. One thing I have noted is that Orthodox communities tend to have a lot more alcohol, hard liquor at their Kiddush scenes than non-Orthodox spaces. Also, that conservative and Reform places tend to have much more variations of American comfort food. So it's either it's macaroni and cheese or it's a sweet dairy noodle kugel, as well as the inexpensive tuna salad, egg salad, and maybe some sort of carb, whether it's a mini bagel or a Mizona roll. Mizona roll meaning a roll that came from an Orthodox bakery, Orthodox kosher bakery, that you will say Mizona-san, bring your name is a note, and not hamotzi lechem. Because though it may be bread, there's other things in the bread, which means that you don't need to then say a motzi, which means you don't need a full beer cut. Who makes up these rules? Not me. Do I appreciate that we have these loopholes? Absolutely. Is it ridiculous? Even more so. But it's there. I'm not quite sure where these rules came from. Who then sets the guidelines of what is going to be an Orthodox Kiddush, what's going to be a conservative Kiddush? How do you decide if it's going to be a Kiddush versus a Kiddush lunch? And what, like, is it just going to be that there's going to be a couple pieces of herring? Is herring really falling to the wayside? Is it because there are fewer herring manufacturers? There's a lot to be said about this. And I am not quite the person to say it quite yet.
I grew up with Vita herring. I think Vita is probably owned by some conglomerate at this point.
You can buy Vita at Costco.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of their herring and wine sauce.
And also, I'm a big fan of whitefish. You can still get.
Sure, whitefish. Great Lakes Michigan whitefish is the best whitefish you can get. Acme makes a wonderful smoked whitefish. I don't know where they source their whitefish from. But yeah, I definitely grew up with a whitefish pickerel blend from my mother's gefilte fish.
Do you know the origin of black and whites?
The black and whites cookies?
Yeah.
I don't know.
They were always very popular at Kiddush.
Yeah, not in my world. We had 7-layer cake. Or for Kiddush, we had 3-layer cake, which was the same cake, but instead of it being yay tall and 7 layers, it was only 3. My grandfather, my mother's father, Jules, Papa Jules, he always said he wanted to eat only the 5th and 6th layers. We were very confused because we didn't know which way he was counting from. So he ended up eating the entire slice, but he said he only wanted the 5th and the 6th.
You said there were 3 events that were significant. Did you cover the 3rd event?
I didn't cover the 3rd event.
Can you tell us what that is?
Sure. The 3rd event would be my family's Shabbat table. So it's not a unique one-time only event. The thing that every Friday night we would have Shabbat dinner. My mother is an amazing baker and cook and would always make fresh challah every Friday. Nowadays she actually makes challah shaped by something inspired by the Parsha of the week. Yeah, now that she's no longer teaching Hebrew school, she's become a Parsha educator of sorts through Instagram. And so she makes a challah of the week, challah every week shaped by either a Parsha or the holiday. And so an upcoming holiday in the next week. And every week we would sit down, Shabbos dinner, and my mother would have made challah. She would bless the candles. We would bless the Kiddush, or they would bless the children, me and my 2 older brothers. And then we would do Kiddush, and then Motzi, and we'd have dinner. We would also eat as a family most of the week, but there was something special about Shabbat dinner. And as I mentioned earlier, we didn't go out on Friday night. So there we were, sitting down, having Shabbat dinner. Oftentimes friends and family would be there, but there was always Shabbat dinner. Yeah.
It had a great influence on you.
Very much so. I would say that food as a means of accessing Judaism and a means of holding on to tradition is really a framing that I keep with me in most of the work that I do. And one of the reasons that I now have this job is because I was interested in Jewish food. I was interested in Jewish cultural foodways, Jewish food culture. And now I do Jewish cultural history more broadly. I still am most excited when I come across an excerpt in Shalom Aleichem where they're talking about having buttered black bread with a slice of onion on it. Or when I come across a 1901 Tunisian cookbook written in Judeo-Arabic that we now get to publish in English translation, because no one would ever read that. And no one probably had noticed that the National Library of Israel had that. But I get to find this and I'm feeling empowered through my work to bring this forward.
So the Posen Library is publishing recipes?
Yes, there are recipes in some of the work that we are doing. Absolutely. We just had translated a section of a Ladino poem about las berenjenas, the eggplants, and it is a 36 or 39 couplet poem. Each stanza, each section being 4 stanzas, and each section being a different recipe for an eggplant dish, originally written in Ladino in the 16th century, if not earlier. And so we're getting a large portion of this translated and available in one of our volumes. And so there are recipes, because food is a very important part of Jewish identity throughout all of history. We are culinary chameleons. We adopt the foods that we have around us. We adopt the foods within our own community, and we adopt the foods as we travel. And we make them our own through Shabbos and Kashrut. And we also can then bring those back out as representatives of who and how Jews are eating and what Jewish life was like in that period.
I'm going to ask you a question that's kind of far field from what we've been talking about, and that is, you have two brothers. Can you tell me what they've done with their lives so far in terms of their interests?
Oh, I'm the black sheep in the family. If you can
they went
imagine,
into the scrap metal business?
No. There was one thing we were forbidden from doing. Two things in my family that we were forbidden from doing. One was working in the scrap metal business. That was outright forbidden, verboten. The second was doing a job that required ladders. Because my mother, working as an OT, had a patient who fell off a ladder, and because of that, no ladders for the Robinson boys. It's okay. My brothers have done pretty well for themselves. My oldest brother, Ruby, who was most recent, he got married about a year ago. He is an immigration attorney, lives in the city of Detroit, and works for the Michigan Immigrants' Rights Center, and defends people, keeps families together, and defends the American immigration law to ensure that people are not unjustly sentenced, because immigrants have significantly fewer rights and opportunities in our country than anyone else does. And it's really easy to bully those who do not have an understanding of the legal system, and who do not have the opportunity to afford an attorney. So that's what my brother does. His wife, Ifat, is a social worker. She does great things as well. And then my brother, Ian, spent, we call him Yoni, but he spent 6 of the past 10 years in South America, most recently doing social responsible business development and support for startups in living in Santiago, Chile, but working throughout South America, and now works for a startup that uses machine learning to help cities find lead service lines so that they can take those lead service lines out, so people don't have to suffer what happened in Flint if there are problems in their water systems.
Is he working out of South America doing this?
No, he lives in Detroit now.
Now he's in Detroit.
Yeah.
He's come back to the homeland.
He has come back to the homeland, yes. So the whole family's in Detroit, except for me with my nomadic life. But
do you have any advice for young people who are in school in terms of how they should learn? What brought you to have such an interesting, variegated life? Can you give some suggestions to young people or people who are in school?
Sure. I will say that there is so much to learn out there. Learning for the sake of a job doesn't seem as relevant for most professions in the 21st century. If you want to work in medicine, if you want to be a lawyer, obviously you need to do those things. But in general, a lot of the knowledge can be found in situ, in those spaces that you're working on. Or a lot of the professional development that you can get is going to happen. If you're working for a business, they will train you when you get hired. But you need to know how to think. And so whether that is learning how to think critically and asking questions, looking at material and saying, so what? Why does this matter? What is this relevant to? Why is this history seemingly true? What is happening here? And trying to peel back a couple of the layers and peel back some of that curtain. That is something that you should be going out of your way to learn. And while you're also doing that, finding things that you're interested in, not just what the core curriculum is demanding that you take. It worked out very well for me, and I'm not going to say it did for you, but to take classes that you are actually super excited about, or professors that you know are great teachers, to take community courses because you know that that's actually a type of space or the type of people that you want to surround yourself with, and they're going to help you become a better thinker and a better agent of change. If all you want to do is make money, you should do this too, because you should still be a better human being. Finding things that move you, you will then move things further. Finding how you can be the best version of yourself will mean that the change that you are going to be doing will be that much more impactful. You may know how to cure cancer, but until you know how to take care of yourself through diet, through sleep, through exercise, also just knowing what's good for you in terms of the relationships you have with others, the relationships you have with your community, your family, your faith, whatever these things are, until you come to terms with that in yourself, it doesn't matter if you know how to cure cancer, because you're not going to be able to be an effective version of yourself. So finding the things that you need, finding the intellectual strivings that you want, will allow you to make the change you want. Whether that is just to make a lot of money for yourself, which I understand we live in times where that may be important to you, or finding a way to make the social change that you want, the political impact that you need, the fact that you just want to travel all around the world. Yeah, I would say find ways that you can come to find your best version of yourself, and the other things will fall into place.
Thank you very much, Avery, for this interview. I really appreciate it. On behalf of the Jewish Historical Society of Western Massachusetts, thank you.
My pleasure.